trustees. I really wouldn't want to be one of the speakers that has to follow that first guy. He did a pretty nice job. Having another round of applause for him. I don't want to hold things up, but we do have a preservation announcement that I'd like to make, and I'm going to bring somebody up to do that. But before I do, I'd like to recognize our Battlefields Foundation Board of Trustees. There's 15 or 16 of them at any given time, and they work very, very hard. They're required to participate not only in board meetings, but also in chairing and being members of committees. They are responsible for the entire organization, and sometimes that's easier than at other times. And so they do a lot of the heavy lifting with our organization administratively. They oftentimes are our largest givers and those who give the most of their talents, their time, and their resources. And so if you're a member of the Board of Trustees, if you could please stand and be recognized, that would be great. And some of the Board of Trustees were on the board when I was hired. I think they're still maybe questioning that decision, but one of those individuals is Mr. Childs Burton, and I think most of you all know Childs. He has been a fixture in the preservation and conservation community in Virginia for decades, and he's been with the Battlefields Foundation for 13 or 14 years now. He's been a leader in preservation, former member of the board of the American Battlefield Trust. His resume goes on and on in our field of interest. He has been a true friend of Battlefields Foundation, and he has been a real mentor of mine. And I'd like to ask him to come up and to give us an announcement. Thank you.
So I have been on this board a long time, and Kevin tells me I can stay on the board until such time he turns me upside down and nothing comes out of my mouth. I've dropped off some brochures on all the tables. Tammy has some brochures outside on the table as well. This is the Piedmont Heritage Area Association conference that I've been putting together now for, my God, 27 years. And it's going to be, we haven't done this in 10 years, but it's going to be on the 62 Valley campaign. And I think it's especially important to do this campaign again in view of the fact of the incredible amount of preservation that has been taking place, largely for the benefit of the foundation and all the good work that they've done. But going through the 1862 Valley campaign today, you'll see literally hundreds and hundreds of acres that have been restored, core battlefield. And so we are going to revisit that. And Kevin is one of our top speakers, as well as Gary and Scott, Gary Eckerbarger and Scott. Jeff Word will be there as well, and Dennis Scott. So come join us early in October if you can. I have been tasked to open up a new project that the foundation is taking on. And it is right in the center of what I was just talking about, the 1862 Valley campaign. How many have been to the Union Church at Cross Keys Battlefield? How many of you know? Well, I would have thought more. Well, if you haven't been there, if you go there today, you'll be at a church site. Here's a image of what that church looked like in the wartime period. It's right overlooking the entire Cross Keys battlefield. As you're in front of the church, you're looking out on agricultural fields that are now been protected on either side of Port Republic Road to some high ground just on the south side of Low Creek. The high ground now known as Artillery Ridge. And it's the ground over which Fremont's forces would charge to take that ridge. And they will be stopped by Richard Buell's forces who are up there on Artillery Ridge. Here is the picket position 15th Alabama that will first get engaged with Fremont's forces as they come down, and they will draw back to that high ground, and the battle will unfold. So we have an opportunity here that just happened at the church. Union Church has agreed to sell their property of a little over 2 acres. We use it as a interpretation site now. And they've agreed to sell it to us for $250,000. And so I've got a lot of ribbons on this name tag, but one of them is a legacy corps. The legacy corps are those of us who have made estate arrangements to give to the foundation upon our death. And somebody out there generously included the foundation in their will to the amount of $230,000, I believe it is. $130,000, I believe it is. So I've asked a family foundation to help us with this cause, and they've agreed to put $15,000 down. My wife and I are putting $10,000, a total of $25,000. So what I'd like to do today is to ask you to help us with this cause, so we're able to purchase this property, which will be absolutely a central place for meeting and explaining and interpreting the battle. If you can give as much as you can, with the $130,000 and the $25,000 I'm just now putting forward on the table, we can meet largely the total purchase price. The idea then would be to go out with a mailing appeal to say that the conference here and some of the trustees and board have put enough money in here that they will match dollar for dollar to get us over the top. So I would ask you to help us with that. I know my friend Bob Crick, who wrote one of the best volumes on the 1862 Valley campaign. And Bob is, a tight German fellow, and he's putting some money into this as well. So help us today if you can, and we'll save a very, very integral part of the Cross Keys Valley. Thank you very much.
For your generous gift and your challenge, and as you all know, we telethon. So we're going to get set up and see if we can accommodate you all, helping Childs get this piece of property preserved. So Childs has challenged us to see if we can match his money today. He's put up $25,000. I think looking around the room, I mean, heck, I can see some of you can just do that, before lunch. So at any rate, thanks so much, and we'll have Jack go back up here and introduce the person.
All right, back to part 2. Next up we have Mr. Ryan Quint. Ryan's a native of Southern Maine. He was hesitant to give me the exact location. We know the effect of Mainers here in the room. He graduated with a degree from history from the University of Mary Washington. Ryan has also worked for a number of years in public history museums, including the George Washington Foundation and Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. I asked him, I said, where'd you work at? Colonial Williamsburg. I just went there a couple years ago, and he said he was at the Powder Magazine a lot. And it wasn't until right after he left they discovered it was the burial of some 1862 remains. He was waiting for a moment to talk about the Civil War, and it was right after he left. But that's why we brought you on today, just to check that off your list. And he's also worked for the National Park Service. His first book was Determined to Stand and Fight the Battle of Monocacy, which was published as part of the Emerging Civil War series, the 7th. And his second publishing is Dranesville, a northern Virginia town in the crossfire of a forgotten battle. And that was published in 2024. Ladies and gentlemen, Ryan Quint.
Morning, everyone. Morning. How are we doing? Good. See some friendly faces, see some nice faces. I think Craig Mertz is still chuckling about that Bob Crick joke. Very good. Yes, we're going to talk about Monocacy today. Battle outside Frederick, Maryland, July 9th, 1864. A battle not huge in scale, but huge in ramifications. Show of hands who's been to Monocacy? know, a park that has gained a lot of recognition and stature over the last few years, I think by the hard work of the park staff there. I have not worked there, but I'm friends with many of them, and they work their tails off, that's for sure, so they deserve all the credit in the world. I have to first turn this off. Then I have to thank John Eric, right? Because he gets to save me about 10 minutes of this talk, right? Because my first few slides are about this guy named David Hunter. I don't know if any of you have heard of him before. So just a real quick recap, right? In the early spring of 1864, numerous federal campaigns are centered in Virginia. After Franz Siebel's defeated Newmarket, David Hunter takes the reins, and he does all the things that John Eric just talked about. He does this, he does that. You know, these two guys, I'm sure none of you have ever heard of before. U.S. Grant Robert E. Lee. This guy named Jubal Anderson Early marches to Charlottesville, takes the train to Lynchburg, fights a battle there. Again, I'm just breezing through because we already talked about this. Where I want to start is what happens as Hunter is retreating to all the places John Eric just talked about. What is Jubal doing? And we're going to start our story here. Early has basically three choices following his victory at Lynchburg. Choice one is to just return to Robert E. Lee in Petersburg, right? Could be a possible alternative, right? Grant is already at Petersburg, the fighting has already started there. Lee would certainly welcome the 9 or 10,000 men and Early would bring back to him. That's one choice. Choice two is to just stay in the valley and babysit it and make sure there's no other federal incursions into the valley in 1864. And then there's choice three, which I think is the most interesting one, and it's the one that Jubal Early talks about on June 28, 1864, from Stanton, when Early writes to Robert E. Lee. And he says, I therefore decided to turn down the valley, according to your instructions, to threaten Washington if I find an opportunity to take it. And I want to pause on this quote, because I think too often Early's campaign into Maryland is reduced to a cursory raid. He's going to go up, he's going to come back. And yet this quote, if I find an opportunity to take it, I think bears a lot of weight. By the late summer, or I guess middle of summer 1864, Confederate forces know that the forts around Washington have been largely stripped. They know that because they've been fighting the guys who were in the forts around Washington. The heavy artillerists, if you know, men who were given muskets and assigned duty as infantry. So Early knows that D.C. is kind of just hanging there. And it's June 1864. What's in November? What's coming up in November? The election still kind of hangs in the balance, right? Now we know that Lincoln's going to win that election because of things that are to happen but have not happened yet. Let's kind of do a snapshot, right? In June 1864, how's the Union war effort going? It's been a year since Gettysburg and Vicksburg. It's been a year since these two great turning points, and yet Grant's campaign against Richmond has slogged down. Sherman had literally just the day before been defeated at Kennesaw Mountain. And so if you're a Northern voter, you're kind of going, I don't know. What's going to happen if 15,000 Confederates march on Washington? And if I find an opportunity to take it, can Early hold D.C.? Probably not. But does that matter? What is the political kind of PR victory of Confederate force in Washington for a day or for 2 days? What does that do to the Confederate treasury supplies? What does that, or to Union treasury supplies if Confederates were to raid it? What does that do if Jubal Early would put the Confederate flag above the Capitol or above the White House? All of these things are at play. And so I find an opportunity to take it. And so Early marches north. He marches down the valley. And because Hunter has so graciously vacated the valley, there's really nobody to defend as Early's movement heads north. And he gets as far as Winchester, who'd have thought, by July 2nd, before anyone really is understanding what's going on. So this map here is of the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad. The red line is the actual railroad tracks. And the reason I highlight it is because it is not U.S. Army forces who are the first ones to ring the alarm bell about what's happening in the lower valley. Rather, it is the president of the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad, a guy named John Garrett, who on June 29th has this quote, writing to Washington saying, there are Confederates with nefarious purposes in the lower valley. Don't know what they're doing, but you should all probably look into that. Just a gentle suggestion. Right? But Grant and Henry Halleck dropped the ball. And I say this as someone who I think U.S. Grant is one of the best generals of the war, if not American history. He drops the ball in late June, early July 1864, because he buys into kind of false intelligence that Robert Lee has planted at Petersburg. Lee has had kind of people acting as deserters to go into Union lines and claim they are from Early's force. So if they're in Petersburg saying we're from Early's force, Grant's saying, well, Early can't be in the valley because Early's here. And Henry Halleck says, yeah, I agree with Grant. And so that's bothering Garrett to no end. And here on July 3rd, 1864, Grant is sticking to his opinion that Early is in Petersburg. Now, what bothers John Garrett so much is that the Confederates will not stop burning his railroad. And it's getting kind of irritating, right? They attacked it in 1862, they attacked it in 1863, he has to go back to his shareholders and say, yeah, they burned it again. And so Garrett would really rather not do that in 1864. And so realizing that U.S. Grant and Henry Halleck are not going to be of help, Garrett says to heck with this. And he goes to Baltimore. And he meets with Lew Wallace. I'll go back just for a second. This is the Iron Railroad Bridge that Garrett is most concerned about over the Monocacy River. This is the bridge that the Confederates have burned twice before. And so this is the bridge that has cost Garrett tens of thousands of dollars each of the 2 preceding years. This is the bridge he's most concerned about. This is the bridge that Henry Halleck and Grant are not quite on the same wavelength. And that's why John Garrett goes to Baltimore. To the Utah House Hotel, which was the headquarters for the middle department of Lewis Wallace. Right? Lew Wallace is an interesting guy. We can spend the next 7.5 hours talking about Lew Wallace if you want, because it's so fascinating. He's 37 years old. He's had an up and down career during the Civil War. He is not a West Point grad. His father had been the governor of Indiana, so he's got some political connections. He did well at Fort Donelson. I think he does pretty well at Shiloh. Grant Halleck disagrees. He defends Cincinnati, Ohio. And so he's had this up and down career. Henry Halleck hates him, cannot stand Lew Wallace. But because of Wallace's political connections, in the spring of 1864, Wallace is in charge of this middle department headquartered in Baltimore. It was thought of a way to get Wallace, a political kind of connected guy, an appointment with absolutely zero possibility of fighting. There's not going to be any fighting in Maryland in 1864, so let's just throw this guy there and make it happen. Wallace, on the other hand, is a guy who's irritated at the fact that he's going to miss the action. He's a guy who thrives on combat, he likes the adrenaline rush, and so on and so on. In a letter to his wife that spring, he says, soon will be heard the thunder of captains, the trumpet and the sound, and the shout, and I will not be there. So he's looking for a fight. When Garrett shows up at his headquarters around July 2nd or 3rd, the date's not exactly clear, but probably the 2nd. And Garrett sits Wallace down and explains the situation. Here's the rub. The Monocacy River and that Iron Railroad Bridge is the westernmost boundary of Wallace's middle department. Anything on the Frederick side of the Monocacy River is outside of Wallace's jurisdiction. Do you think Wallace cares? And so Wallace says, yes, I will secure your railroad bridge. I will guard your railroad bridge. I don't have anybody to do that with, but I'm going to make it happen. And so on July 5th, 1864, around midnight, July 4th into July 5th, Wallace goes to the Camden Yard Station in Baltimore, hops on a train with one staff officer, and heads west to the Monocacy River. To make this big stand against Confederate forces of yet unknown strength, Wallace has a bit of an island of misfit to do this with. His second in command is Brigadier General Erastus B. Tyler, who is essentially persona non grata in the Army of the Potomac. Tyler had commanded a brigade in the Army of the Potomac at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. He had made enemies with Andrew Humphreys, who is now the Chief of Staff of the Army of the Potomac. So Tyler's not welcome within about 100 miles of the front. And he's got about 2,500 soldiers at his disposal. He has a couple of units of Ohio National Guard, who were raised 100-day units just that spring. He has the Maryland Potomac Home Brigade. He has the 11th Maryland at his disposal. That's what he's got. And he has one battery of 6 guns from the Baltimore Light Artillery. And somehow this 2,500 force has to figure out a way to defend the Monocacy River. They start to entrench. They have a blockhouse there with a 24-pounder howitzer. And so Tyler's feeling, confident, and Wallace is feeling like we're gonna see what happens. Private William Butler, 144th Ohio National Guard, talks about this rush to the river. He says, the afternoon of July 4th, we received orders, but were not ordered to leave Camp Parole until the morning of the 7th. About 2 o'clock that morning, we received orders to take the cars in 30 minutes with 3 days' rations and 1 haversack. Not having any provisions cooked, we filled our haversacks with hardtack and raw sow belly and started we knew not whither. So, Wallace is going, and he does cross the Monocacy River. He goes into Frederick proper, so he is violating, technically, the western bounds. He's joined by a few mounted troopers of the 8th Illinois, famous for firing some of the first shots at the Battle of Gettysburg, and, interestingly enough, the Loudon Rangers, who are a pro-Union Virginia outfit who are going to fight alongside Wallace. And it's these troopers who fire some of the first shots in the skirmishes. This is the junction, taken in a photo around 1858. This is the Monocacy Junction. At Monocacy, the Baltimore and Ohio has a split. There's a Frederick line that goes into the city proper, and then the western line heads out towards the Ohio area. What's also interesting, and I think we got to give some fair play here, is the theme of Monocacy is time. Wallace is all about gaining time for officials in Washington. But he's not the only one. I think Franz Sigel deserves a brief moment of recognition, which is not something said often in Civil War communities. But after his defeat at Newmarket, right, Franz Sigel is sent to Harper's Ferry to defend the garrison there, and he does solid work in early July 1864. Jubal Early's original intent was to capture Harper's Ferry and then just follow the Potomac River into the heart of D.C. But Franz Sigel and his small garrison retreat up the bluffs of Maryland Heights, and like a tick, they dig in. They drag a 100-pound Parrott rifle up there, and they control the town. Early sends in some skirmishers on July 4th and 5th to try to lead those guys out. They are not successful, so Early right there loses about a day and a half. Confederate forces do delight in ransacking Harper's Ferry, especially on July 4th, when there was a bunch of patriotic feasts laid out. They take that food, and then Early's plan B is to march across the Potomac River up through the old Antietam battlefield, and then into the South Mountain passes, come down through Frederick, and approach Washington that way. So while Wallace is getting his guys together on the river, Franz Sigel is doing a couple of days' work there. So again, worth mentioning. July 7th, 1864, the vanguard of Early's force comes down off the South Mountain passes. They go through Middletown, down over the Catoctin, and they start heading down to Frederick. And this comes to be known as the Battle of West Frederick. Battle may be a little generous, but there's a lot of shooting and hooting, so let's call it that. The interesting thing about this, that I think, at least, is the paradigm of warfare, right? I mentioned the 8th Illinois, I mentioned the Loudon Rangers, pro-Unionist Virginians. The vanguard of Early's force is Bradley Johnson's Maryland cavalry troopers. So Johnson's cav guys from Maryland, fighting for the Confederates, is going to face off against the Loudon Rangers, Virginians, fighting for the Union. And they start to fire at each other in the western fields outside of Frederick. One Virginian coming down off the mountainside says that there was a tornado over our heads of gunfire as the Marylanders and the Virginians and everybody else and the Illinois guys opened fire. That skirmishing continues into July 8th as Early's men continue to come down off the mountains, And that's when Wallace has a, this might be bigger than I anticipated moment. Because he's watching from Frederick, and he's watching these dust clouds come over the mountain passes. Early has about 15,000 men and 45 guns. And so he's watching, Wallace is, he's watching this column that seemingly never ends, coming down over the mountain, getting ready to go in. He realizes he needs some help. And fortunately for him, some help is arriving. On July 6th, 1864, the same day that kind of Wallace is getting ready on the Monocacy, Grant and Halleck kind of wake up from there. Early must be in Petersburg situation. They go, oh, maybe he is in Maryland. And so what they decide to do is they decide to take troops from the Army of the Potomac in Petersburg and then ship them via steamboats to Baltimore and then get on trains. The original destination for these soldiers was to be Harper's Ferry. And the first troops picked is James B. Ricketts' division of the 6th Army Corps. These guys have been through the ringer, right? They're at the Wilderness, they're at Spotsylvania Courthouse, they're at Cold Harbor. They've been there, done that, got the t-shirt a few times. And so Ricketts, between all of the fighting that spring, has about 3,500 soldiers or so at his disposal. And as he's making their movement north, George Davis in 10th Vermont, we'll hear more from him in just a moment, says at 4 p.m. we were steaming down the James River, thankful for rest, pure air, and to be beyond the reach of shot and shell. We're going to cue the Curb Your Enthusiasm music in just a moment because Davis is getting out of the pan, so to speak. He's going to jump right into the fire at Monocacy. But Halleck is still being kind of obstinate because that same day that Halleck and Grant are working to send James Ricketts to Monocacy, Halleck kind of stubbornly says, I will not send an Army Corps until there is greater necessity for it. What more greater necessity do you need than an unknown Confederate force 50 miles from Washington, D.C.? Ricketts' men arrived early on July 8th. Again, they were supposed to go to Harper's Ferry, so at that spur of the railroad of the B&O, they begin to head west, and Wallace and his staff flag the train down and say, you can't go any further. There are a whole lot of Confederates, you may as well get off here. Ricketts could have said, you're not my boss, but Ricketts agrees to take his troops off, or rather the Union soldiers agreed to take the troops off and work with Wallace. Just as John Eric talks about early using some snazzy movement to scare hunters, so does Wallace. Some of the early soldiers getting off the train here are sent marching in circles to make their force look bigger. The 10th Vermont comes to go around one hill so many times, they name it Deception Hill, because they just marched in circles. And Wallace is doing the same thing that Early did, he's making his force look a little bit bigger. Ricketts himself arrives early on the morning of the 9th. He's taking the rear guard column, so he arrives early on the 9th. Wallace realized, even with Ricketts at his disposal, he doesn't have enough people to fight from the Frederick side of the Monocacy River. So what is he going to do? On the night of July 8th, using a heavy rainstorm for cover, Wallace moves his forces on the far side of the Monocacy River. And he writes what I think is kind of a bone-chilling report to Washington. And he says, the Confederates, with strong column, are moving down the Washington Pike towards Urbana. They're within 6 miles of that place. I will withdraw from Frederick and put myself in position on the road to cover Washington. This is it. Wallace is going to have to fight to delay. There is nobody else. The river is going to be his aid. The Monocacy gets its name from the Shawnee people, who called it the Monocacy for River of Many Bends. So the fact that it curls and twirls and does all these ups and downs and loop-de-loops makes it so that there are only a few accessible fords that you can cross the river at. And so Wallace positions his small force on those fords. On the north side of the battlefield, Tyler, with the Ohio National Guard and the Marylanders we've been talking about, are going to guard what's called the Jug Bridge, which carries a national pike towards Baltimore. Ricketts is going to guard the Iron Railroad Bridge that John cared so much about, and what's called the Covered Bridge. so 2 vital railroad crossings. Wallace, in his autobiography, waxes poetic, which I know is unsurprising, right? Lew Wallace, the great author, can turn a phrase. And he says, now there is nobody between Early and Washington but us. If we can maintain ourselves here, and by hook or crook get 36 or 40 hours on Early, that, added to the marching required to him, will give General Grant ample time to get a corps or 2 into Washington and make it safe. Now, Wallace is writing that quote in 1905 with the benefit of hindsight, but I think the point still stands. The theme of this battle is time. I don't think Wallace has any illusions of grandeur. I don't think he expects to win this fight, but he's going to delay as much as he can. 15 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. We're going to see what happens. Wallace is aided by some Confederate mistakes that Early has made. We're going to go into more of them as we go on. The first thing is just administrative. I don't necessarily think it's a mistake, but more so a failure at the top. So this screen here is a general breakdown of Early's order of battle for the campaign. And so here's the problem. John C. Breckinridge, the victor of Newmarket, has been given the title of a corps commander. So he commands 2 divisions, John B. Gordon's division and John Eccles. But the other 2 divisions in Early's force, Robert Rhodes and Stephen Ramseur, are not under any kind of corps. They're independent division commanders. They do not answer to anybody except Jubal Early. Rhodes is the senior of the 2, but there is nobody at the top calling the shots. So when you talk about unity of command, which we'll get to, or commander's intent, who exactly is in charge? Now, you might say, right, well, Jubal Early's in charge. He will just tell them what to do. But Jubal Early himself gets distracted in the town of Frederick, right, with the ransom of the city of Frederick. As Early's force has marched through Maryland, he has levied certain ransoms on various towns. The town of Hagerstown, the town of Middletown, or ransom. And the levies had not gone super well, especially in Hagerstown. Jubal Early had intended to demand $200,000 from the city of Hagerstown, the town of Hagerstown. But the Confederate officer in charge of delivering that demand dropped a decimal point. And so $200,000 became $20,000. And so when that Confederate force returns to Early's headquarters and says, here's your bag of money, and Early's like, 1, 2, 3, you're going to be missing $180,000. And so Early decides if you're going to do something right, do it yourself. So on the morning of July 9th, 1864, as the battle is going to get started, Early is not at the front. Early stays at the home of a man named Dr. Hammond, which is basically across the street from the town hall, and he delivers via proxy a demand to the town leaders. I want $200,000. I want all this bacon, all this flour, all this coffee, all this salt. And if you don't give it to me, I'm going to burn the town of Frederick. And the town leaders say, we're good. Because the town leaders are thinking, what if, snowball's chance here, what if Wallace wins this one? Why would we pay a ransom to a Confederate force that may have to retreat at the end of the day? And so the town leaders delay, they drag their feet. And rather than Early just going over to the town leaders himself and talking face to face, there's this yakety sax routine where throughout the day, Confederate staff officers go to the headquarters, go to the city hall. The town leaders say, we're good. They go back to Early. Early says, no, you gotta, raise his hell and slams his fist. And they go back to the town leaders and they go, General Early is displeased. And he just goes back and forth, right? There's a city resident named Catherine Eccles, or let me see what her name is. Catherine Markle, excuse me. There's a city resident named Catherine Markle, Confederate sympathizer, who talks about at noontime, Confederate staff officers were visiting her and paying her visits and courteously calling. The battle is happening 3 miles away, and the army commander, if you will, is in Frederick, and his staff are engaged on playing house calls to young women. Okay. So we have this problem, right? battle starts again around 9 o'clock, early in Frederick. The battle starts around 9 o'clock with the vanguard of Robert Rhodes and Stephen Ramseur going to the front. Here's the problem. We don't really know what they were trying to do. Robert Rhodes is killed just a few miles from here in September of 1864. Stephen Ramseur is killed at Cedar Creek in 1864. Neither of them write a report about the Battle of Monocacy. So what exactly were they ordered to do on the morning of July 9th is a huge question. They don't have any kind of ordinance, they don't have any kind of correspondence to each other, none that's at least survived. At the risk of a joke, maybe they're using the Signal app to communicate, I do not know. And so the dispatches, their communication is, again, a question mark. What we do know is that Robert Rhodes will slide his force over to the Jug Bridge. Ramseur's men will be assigned to attack the covered bridge and the railroad bridge. They start with this artillery fire. Reminder that Jubal Early has 45 guns to play with. Lew Wallace has 7. He has the 6 guns of the Baltimore Light Artillery and 1 24-pound howitzer. The howitzer gets off maybe 1 shot, and then the inexperienced crew loads it incorrectly. Let's review really quickly. To load a Civil War cannon, you want powder first, then shell. They do it the other way around. They put the shell down and they go, I don't think that's how that works. And in the chaos of combat, they were unable to get it back off in operation for the battle. And so a veteran of the 110th Ohio, one of Ricketts' guys, says, oh, but if we had just brought our Potomac battery with us, it would have been all right. So here these armed Potomac veterans kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. The other guy stuck between a rock and a hard place is George Davis of the 10th Vermont. The same guy who had talked about, isn't it so great to be out of Petersburg? Wallace, that morning, sends 275 skirmishers back across the river to act as a screening force for these 2 bridges, the railroad bridge and the covered bridge. 75 skirmishers came from the 10th Vermont, 200 skirmishers came from the Potomac Maryland Home Brigade. The initial commander of this force is Lieutenant Colonel Chandler of the 10th Vermont. Without telling anybody, he recrosses the river and spends the battle hiding in the shadows of a mill. He will subsequently be court-martialed for actions also at Cedar Creek, so not a super great guy. The next commander is a guy named Captain Brown of the Maryland Potomac Home Brigade, who this is his first battle. And as Ramseur's men come down the road and deploy skirmishers, they are wearing uniforms recently captured at Martinsburg and Harper's Ferry. So they're wearing blue uniforms. And the 10th Vermont guys are screaming their heads off. Those are the bad guys. We should probably shoot them. But Brown demurs and says, I think they're our guys. And they get the drop on him, and they kill or wound a few Union soldiers. And so Brown then politely says, well, you're the experienced guy, why don't you take over? And so Lieutenant Davis, in charge of 275 people, will have to fight a battle basically of his own, a separate battle from the main engagement, because Wallace has the great idea of burning the covered bridge. If the Confederates need to get across the river, let's just burn the bridge. But neglects to tell Davis before they do that. And so Davis looks over his shoulder, and the bridge is catching on fire, and I imagine his reaction is something I can't say out loud. But I imagine something along the lines of, that's not ideal, right? And so he's going to have to fight his own battle, separated from the main force, separated by the river, and this kind of back and forth fighting. What we're going to next focus on is some of Robert Rhodes' early efforts against the Jug Bridge. So the Jug Bridge had been built in 1806 into 1807. It's a stone trestle bridge, as you see, and it gets its unique name from this thing on the lower right-hand corner of the photograph, where there's this kind of reservoir-looking thing, and as lore would have it, they put a barrel of whiskey inside, and they called it the Jug Bridge. Now, whether they did or not, I don't know. But the name stuck, and so you have the Jug Bridge. It's 425 feet long across the Monocacy, and 2 units of the Ohio National Guard will be deployed to defend that bridge. Colonel Allison Brown of the Ohio National Guard is put in charge of that first line. He had had some experience earlier in the war, And so it makes sense for him to be there. Rhodes's men are headed by these sharpshooter battalions that many of you are probably familiar with, right? In 1863, Lee had the idea of creating these battalions of the crack shots. These were men who were excused from camp duty, and when battle started, they would deploy and pick up high-value targets. At Monocacy, they're headed by Major Eugene Blackford. And it's these sharpshooters who start to pick off the Ohio National Guard. And George Perkins of the 149th Ohio National Guard says, quote, "Then came the tug of war. Brown's men are returning fire. There are small charges and countercharges back and forth. One of Tyler's aides, Edward Goldsboro, who was the city attorney in Frederick, has this story about so accurate was their fire, it was dangerous for us to show our hands." And so the fighting starts to stabilize, right? Because the sharpshooters, remember, are the skirmish line. They haven't been told, cross the river at all hazards, secure the bridge. Robert Rhodes isn't pushing anybody because he hasn't been told, because Jubal Early is doing what? He's asking for money. And so no one at the front really knows what's going on. Around 10 o'clock, 10:30 or so in the morning, John McCausland, or about him already, John McCausland's Mounted Infantry Brigade finds a ford on the south side of the battlefield called the Worthington-McKinney Ford. In his memoirs, Jubal Early says, "I found the ford." That is not correct. I think is the best way to put that, the best polite way to put that. Early does not arrive on the battlefield until about 2 p.m. Fighting starts at 9 a.m., and so from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., who's in charge of the Confederate effort in Monocacy is a big question mark. But I think it's fair to say he doesn't find the ford. McCausland does. McCausland gets across the ford and rides up a small plateau to the Worthington house. In the irony of all ironies, right, John Worthington, the property owner, had lived in Baltimore in 1861. And the Pratt Street riots and the dangers of that say, "I don't want to live here anymore, let's move to quiet Frederick County." And so they live in this house, and his 6-year-old son, Glenn, who's in the left of the photograph, spends the day in the family basement. And what's so interesting about Glenn Worthington is that he grows up to become a well-respected judge in Frederick, and in the 1930s, he writes one of the first histories of the battle, called Fighting for Time by Glenn Worthington. And so he has this front row seat of the battle that's about to happen. McCausland thinks two things. One, he's now in the rear of the Union lines. And two, he thinks that anyone in front of him is just 100-day militia. They're not going to stand. We've fought in a bunch of places. We know better than them. Let's just go and scare them. He orders his men to dismount, and rather than every fourth man holding the reins, he says, "Just tie the horses to a fence. Let's get as many guys on front as we can, and let's go deal with this militia." What he doesn't know is that Wallace sees this and orders Ricketts to deploy his 2 brigades of very experienced infantry to deal with this threat. Ricketts' men find a fence line. They're covered by a high cornfield. Everybody's kind of crouched down. And Ricketts' experienced men allow McCausland's guys to get within about 100 yards before they rise up, level their muskets, and then shoot. Glenn Worthington, quote, "Watched from a distance, the whole rebel line disappeared as if swallowed up in the earth. Save and except several riderless horses galloping about, the attacking force had vanished." McCausland's men retreat in disarray back up to the Worthington house. Confederate officers try to inspire them into action by threatening to shoot them. And so Glenn's mother shouts out, "Poor creatures, it means death to them either way." One officer, Lieutenant Colonel William Taverner of the 17th Virginia, has the bright idea of, "I can't see anything. Somebody let me climb up on their shoulders and I can look down and see what's going on." And so he climbs up on this dude's shoulders, dude is the proper term, and they both stand up. So you've got one guy with Taverner on his shoulders. If you're Ricketts' guys, who do you shoot at? And so William Taverner and his accomplice are killed almost immediately, and they fall down in a heap. McCausland reorganizes and attacks about 45 minutes to an hour later. This time he'll try to flank around Ricketts. He gets into the farmstead of a guy named Christian Kiefer Thomas, the Thomas Farm, before he is again repelled. So Confederate effort is kind of waxing and waning. You've got Robert Rhodes and Stephen Ramsey kind of pot-shotting at Union forces skirmisher style. You have John McClaughlin's guys getting torn up pretty good. What's the breaking point? The breaking point is the arrival of the photograph of the attack here. If you've been to Monocacy, many of you raise your hands, you know that the Worthington farm in the distance and the Thomas farm are now split by 270, right? So I have to imagine that McClaughlin looked carefully both ways before he... So the breaking point is the arrival of John B. Gordon. Gordon's guys have also fought just about everywhere. And they are peeved, I think is the polite way to put it. They had skirmished at Harper's Ferry on July 4th and 5th. And they had been told, under no certain circumstances, you get to sit this one out. We'll cross the river, we'll deal with the threat, take it easy, pick up your shoes, kick your feet back. And now they're told, well, we actually need you at the front. And so Gordon's men very angrily cross the Monocacy, and they form up under the protection of what's called Brooks Hill. Gordon commands some of the hardened veterans of the entire Confederate Army. The Georgia Brigade under Clement Evans, Zebulon York's Brigade, they're the survivors of the Louisiana Tigers. William Terry commands the survivors of the Stonewall Brigade. Yep. And I say survivors because many of these men had been clumped together following the disaster of the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania Courthouse. The survivors of that have been clumped together. Between his 3 brigades, John B. Gordon commands the remnants of 31 infantry regiments. On paper, a regiment is how many? At Monocacy, he commands 3,500 guys. So in 31 infantry regiments, there are 3,500 people now. And so Gordon advances around 5 p.m. And he advances in what's called an echelon formation, which means they will be staggered. Evans will step off first around 3:30, 3:45. York will step off around 4. Terry will step off around 4:15. And the idea behind this is that the attack force is staggered. Meaning, if you're Ricketts' men, you get sucked into repelling Evans' attack. And you might fire at York's men too. But in theory, what should happen is that if they get engaged with Evans and York, that will allow William Terry the freedom to move unopposed, right? Do you want to be Evans' guys who go in first? Anyone? Casualties especially high, right? Clement Evans is hit in the chest, and he is, the bullet ricochets into his housewife, which is a sewing kit, right? The soldiers carried in their breast pocket. And the whole thing explodes. Pins and needles go everywhere. And in his memoirs that John B. Gordon writes decades later, he says that Evans was still picking needles out of his chest. The 61st Georgia Infantry get pretty heavily hit. Their commander, a guy named John Lamar, is killed instantly. And their second in command, a guy named James Van Valkenburg, is also killed instantly. The day after the battle, they are buried at Thomas Farm near the Garden. They're subsequently moved to Georgia, but John B. Gordon attends that funeral and then writes to his wife, and he says, why am I spared, and so many and so good men are taken around me? I cannot repay such mercy. And so the fighting continues. And the fighting at the Thomas Farm is the bloodiest of the battle. It takes about 90 minutes to resolve. There are, give or take, 2,200 casualties in the Battle of Monocacy. 2,000 of them come at the Thomas Farm. In 90 minutes of combat, 2,000 casualties. It's roughly 1 person hit every 3.5 seconds. And it is a stand-up, knockdown war. So what happens here? We've got experienced veterans on both sides. There's not enough time to dig in. There's no trenches. There's no fortifications. Stand up, blast away at each other. Casualties are not limited to just the Confederates, however. Federal forces also have high casualties. William Seward, that's a familiar name, right? Secretary of State. His son, William Seward Jr., Colonel of the 9th New York Heavy Artillery, his ankle is broken when his horse is killed and rolls over on his bones. The 14th New Jersey loses 5 commanding officers in sequence. One of them is Sim Stoltz, who was killed. The 14th New Jersey's color guard, quote, in almost the time it has taken me to write it, completely annihilated. So 5 men shot, pick up the flag, shot, pick up the flag, shot. The 9th New York Heavy Artillery suffers 201 casualties. The 14th New Jersey suffers 140. They're the highest losses of any Union regiment in the field. One person who is not killed or wounded is Alexander Springsteen, Company A of the 14th New Jersey. Springsteen from New Jersey. It's his great-great-grandfather. So if you're a rock fan, be a fan of Monocacy and the fact that Alexander Springsteen wasn't ever killed. Okay. Had to include. All right. Ricketts' men eventually do break, and they retreat in confusion. Right? They're outnumbered. They're out of ammunition. They're forced to withdraw. Tyler's men fight a rearguard action around the jump bridge around 6 o'clock p.m. Before they also retreat. George Davis has to find a way across the bridge. The covered bridge has been burned and long destroyed. And so Davis has to quite literally hopscotch his way to safety over the Iron Railroad Bridge. The bridge that had caused so much trouble with John Garrett is now George Davis's escape path. According to Glenn Worthington, there was actually a sign posted that said no pedestrian access. For his actions, George Davis gets the Medal of Honor. A second medal is also awarded to Corporal Alexander Scott, also of the 10th Vermont, for saving the regiment's flags, both of them, in the chaos of the defeat. There is a brief rearguard action. Some of McClaughlin's men pursue Wallace's men to places called Urbana. The 8th Illinois turns and fights them back. They capture the flag of the 17th Virginia, called the Nighthawk Rangers. That is on display at the Monocacy National Mountain. Okay, what is this? I want to take a couple minutes to talk about the Battle of Monocacy kind of as a principle. The Battle of Monocacy was the battle that saves Washington. We're going to talk about that in just a minute as a conclusion. But did it have to? And I don't think it kind of does, right? And so I think Jubal really wins the battle, but at a cost that was kind of higher than he needed it to be. His report on the Battle of Monocacy leaves a lot to be desired. It's 3 sentences long. And I'm going to read it because it's so quick. Quote, I found Wallace in front of Monocacy Junction, his force being stated in northern accounts of 10,000, not true, and consisting in part of the 3rd Division, 6th Corps under Ricketts, which had arrived the day before. This force we attacked in the afternoon of the same day. Rams are demonstrating in front, while Gordon moved across the Monocacy and the enemy's flank and by a route which had been opened by McClellan's brigade of cavalry in a very gallant manner. The enemy in a very short time was completely routed by Gordon and left the field in great disorder and retreated in haste towards Baltimore. Okay. Straightforward, but I think again leaves a lot to be desired. I'm not going to Monday morning quarterback. I'm not going to say, well, he should have done this, because that bothers me to no end when historians do that. What I'm going to do instead is talk about how Early failed in certain regards and how that impacts the battle and makes it a lot bigger than it probably needed to be. We're going to use 9 principles of war really quickly. These come from the U.S. Army's field manual. If you say that's unfair, they are paraphrased from Antoine Jomini's text as well, a text that Early would have been familiar with. So let's talk about it. The 9 principles of warfare. In an anagram called Moss Mouse. Right? Maneuver, place the enemy in a position of disadvantage and flexible application of combat power. All right, he gets half points for that, right? Wallace is stuck on the wrong side of the river. Objective, direct every military operation towards a clearly defined, decisive, attainable goal. Does he do that? No, right? What is the Confederate goal at Monocacy? Get across the river. But how you do that leaves a lot to be desired. Surprise. Strike at a time and place when the manner for the enemy is unprepared. And half point, right? So there's so many ways across the river. Security, prevent the enemy from achieving surprise or require unexpected advantage. Again, half point. Max, concentrate the effects of combat power in the most advantaged place. I don't think he does this, right? When you have Robert Rhodes kind of, you got Stephen Ramsey kind of, and John B. Gordon does all of the fighting, right? Gordon suffers 700 of the Confederates' 1,000 casualties. When 70% of your loss falls in one organization, you didn't accomplish mass. Offensive, seize, retain, and exploit, okay? Unity of command, does he do that? Who's in charge? Who's answering to who? Simplicity, increase the probability that plans to be executed as intended by preparing clear, uncomplicated plans and orders. Does he do that? Zero, right? Economy of force, we spend minimal essential combat power on secondary efforts. The main effort, get across the river. Does he do that? Not really. So by my calculation, he gets 3.5 out of 9. So in the pop quiz that is the Battle of Monocacy, early scores a 40, right? All right, I got a couple minutes left. So the end result, 2,200 casualties. 1,200 Union, 600 of which were captured, which is John Tracy's ancestor. Confederates suffer about 1,000, and that is entirely killed and wounded. 1,000 men out of a 15,000 man force to get across a river that, had early been more, had he been president, maybe have gone a little bit smoother. He polices the battlefield and he marches south toward Washington. He marches on July 10th, he arrives at the outskirts of Washington, and for the next 2 days, July 11th and 12th, he fights the Battle of Fort Stevens. I know there was supposed to be a speaker to do this, but they cannot make it. So I'm going to jump on Fort Stevens very briefly. Fort Stevens is on the outskirts of Washington. It is one of the rings of the forts, but again, very few people to occupy it. But Wallace's stand at the Monocacy allows troops from the 6th Corps, allows troops from the 19th Corps to be transferred and arrives in Washington. One of my favorite quotes from Abraham Lincoln is he meets the troops arriving at the 6th Street Wharf. And as they disembark, he says, "You cannot be late if you want to catch early." These soldiers double quick through the streets of Washington. Thomas Hyde, a 6th Corps staff officer, talks about the fear on these Washingtonian faces, but they're starting to relax as they realize the 6th Corps is here. On the 12th, Jubal early sees the 6th Corps Greek flag, and he says, "Damn them, we see the 6th Corps everywhere we go." And he agrees, and he comes to the conclusion to not try to attack Fort Stevens in force. He makes the decision to retreat back across the Potomac River on July 14th, 1864. So, in conclusion, right? Battle of Monocacy, high stakes, high drama. Lew Wallace is reflecting on this battle in his memoirs, and he proposes a monument. The monument does not, in fact, go up. But the monument was supposed to be an obelisk, and it was to have the inscription, "These men died to save the capital," and they did save it. Monocacy National Battlefield Park is created in 1934. Some veterans of the war were still alive talking about this. Isaac G. Bradwell was still alive. I think this is a good quote, right? Gettysburg, on a much larger scale than Monocacy, and then we're all over the place. But the latter was even more important. Yes, by all means, let the government make this place a memorial park. Today, Monocacy National Battlefield Park is 1,647 acres of preserved land. Thank you. If you have any questions,
I've got a couple questions. One, was there ever any talk of going to Baltimore instead of DC?
Yes. Robert E. Lee has a rather harebrained plan to send Jubal Early's cavalry force on a long ride to liberate Quint Lookout. Some of those troopers would go around Baltimore. Now, attacking the city itself, no, that's never actually brought up. But some of the troopers go around Baltimore. They attack an ice cream cart and get brain freeze. I'm not joking. They get caught up in this really long-winded ride, but the actual city of Baltimore was never the target.
And you have all these pivotal points in history. It
Yeah.
always seems that there's a calamity of errors.
Yeah.
You have Marylanders fighting for the Confederate, you have Virginians fighting for the... Is there anything that ever looks like it was intentional?
And it never looks like it was intentional. Well, I think the Marylanders leading the vanguard is very intentional, right? Bradley Johnson and one of his second in command, Harry Gilmore, lived in Frederick before the war. They know the roads, they know the area. So I think it's very intentional that they're leading the vanguard.
No, I mean intentionally that they create these calamity awareness.
Oh, I don't think so. I think people are just infallible, and no one's perfect, right? We get hungry, we get tired, we get frustrated, and so mistakes happen. I don't think it's ever, I'm going to intentionally make this mistake. Unless someone's like a super secret double agent. A couple hands. Yes, sir.
Monocacy River, freeway.
Yeah.
I've been there a bunch, but you showed me that last slide, but isn't it one of the forces behind preserving that battlefield? The 6-year-old kid was hiding in the basement when the river was in.
Yeah.
And later on, they wrote about the battle, saw him in the basement.
Yeah.
He was one of the early movers to preserve the battlefield.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think his book, published in the 1930s, is part of that. He's trying to raise awareness of this park. He's buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery today, which is the same place many of the Confederate dead are buried from Monocacy. Union dead were reinterred in the Antietam National Cemetery. Yes, sir.
How much cavalry reconnaissance did Jubal really do prior to heading that direction?
Almost zero. Bradley Johnson and Harry Gilmore leave the morning of the 9th on this raid to Point Lookout, right? That only leaves John McCausland's mounted infantry. They're not even technically cavalry, they're mounted infantry. So with the exception of them crossing the Worthington Ford, almost zero. Yeah, John?
There was considerable panic in Washington.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah.
Repeat the question.
Yes, oh, thank you. The question was, there was considerable panic in Washington, and Childs asked me to elaborate on that. Absolutely. A couple of examples for time's sake. One, there was a steamboat called the Eureka that was ordered at all times to be under steam that could whisk Lincoln away at any given moment. He did not know about that ship, and when he found out, he was infuriated. He wasn't going to leave Washington. Another example, they sandbagged the U.S. Treasury building. Another example, while they're sandbagging the Treasury building, they're teaching clerks in the pension office how to load a musket. The powder goes this way, and so does the bullet. The powder with a hole, you point it that way. That's another example. And then your invalid corps, right? Your veteran reserve corps, where soldiers on light duty are being given muskets and cannons and ramrods and told, you might have to do the thing. These inexperienced artillerists at Fort Stevens are firing these massive shells, and a Confederate soldier said he'd never seen worse gunnery before. Because the shells are flying all over the place. Because these guys are like, I don't know. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, hi. This is kind of Fort Stevens oriented. I appreciate the pinch hitting for that. Do you know, you mentioned Quint Lookout, okay, and the detachment that went down there, which is not a very big mark. Did they go, was their objective to free that Confederate prison right there at Point Lookout?
Yes. So the question, if you can hear it, what's the objective of the Confederate raid on Point Lookout? Yes, the objective was to free the prisoners at Point Lookout, and if everything went according to plan, there was going to be a Confederate naval contingent that would sail up, and all of the Confederate prisoners would get on these ships, and then they would sail them back to safety in Confederate lines. It's a wildly unrealistic plan. The timeline is too short. They have to ride like 275 miles in like 3 days. It's just, everything is completely kaput from the start. Yes, sir. Yeah.
2 points. Well, on that one that you just mentioned, where was the date it was supposed to come from?
So a guy named John Worden, no, that's the Asian commander. Someone help me out. Wood? John Taylor Wood. Gunboats and some steamboats from the James River Squad. Yeah, they're going to sail around.
Were the Union troops
Yeah, go figure, right?
You were the guy that you indicated when early scores started being lined, you remember about 9,000?
Ish, yeah.
I'm guessing perhaps 2,000 or so in Breckenridge's division?
A little bit more, yeah. You got Breckenridge's his force, you got the survivors of Potomac
Where
Jones.
do we get up to these now?
Yeah, survivors of Breckenridge's columns, survivors of Rumble Jones's column, some artillerists who joined in the valley, and our numbers get bumped up.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Did Early receive any ransom from Frederick?
Yes, $200,000. The city of Frederick has not yet received a penny back. And Maryland legislators and senators have proposed bill after bill after bill to be reimbursed. It has not happened. So yeah, now the real question becomes, where did the money go?
Yeah.
Because there's no evidence that he forwards it to Richmond. Does it get burned in the Valley campaign? Does it disappear into people's pockets? I don't know. So where's the money go is a big question mark. Any other questions? Yes, sir. The raid kind of fizzles out, and the Gav troopers, get around the outskirts of Baltimore and say, there's no way in heck this is happening. And they turn back and they rejoin Early in Washington in time for his retreat on the 14th. It remains a Confederate prisoner of war camp through the end of the war. That's all the time we have. Thank you all.
Listen, as you may have gathered from the end of his talk, Stephen Fan will not be with us for the next talk. We learned that on the bus. We got an email during the bus tour yesterday from Stephen, and he said that the event just snuck up on him, and he won't be able to be here. Whatever that means, he did say that he would do it by Zoom. We would prefer that our guests have a live speaker. And so we have a wonderful guy who does too good a job to be considered a fill-in. And we're really actually very, very pleased. Steve Chesley is going to give us a talk about Mulligan at 2nd Winchester. So that's, 2nd Kernstown. That's coming up after the break. And in the meantime, you have 5 minutes to try to match Childs' pledge. And Kirsten will be sitting back there in the back. Thanks.
Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me.
We're not